Hi everyone, and welcome to our next knowledge sharing session. Today we'll talk about Webiny deployment mechanism, and we'll see how Webiny handles your infrastructure, how it creates cloud resources, and how it deploys your actual code to the cloud. So let's first have a quick overview of the core features. So as everything else in Webiny, deployment mechanism is a plugin. It's a CLI plugin. It means that once enabled, it will register two commands to your Webiny CLI, deploy and remove. And deploy command will obviously be for deploying your resources to the cloud, and remove will serve for infrastructure teardown. So whenever you want to remove something, actually your whole project, you simply run Webiny remove and you provide a stack you want to remove, and it will delete all your infrastructure resources. Infrastructure deployment is in no way tied to the code. It only deploys the code, and it knows nothing about your business logic. What it means is that you can modify or completely replace our default deployment mechanism if you prefer CloudFormation, or maybe Terraform, or Pulumi, or any other infrastructure tools that you may be familiar with or work with on a daily basis. So each resource is deployed using a specific component. A component is a simple npm package, and that component holds the deployment logic. Components are written using plain JavaScript, and we use AWS SDK to create resources. So it's very easy to create new components, or if you don't like how some of our components work, you simply create your own and use that in your resource definition. We'll get to that later. Once a specific resource is deployed using a component, it writes a state file to your local drive. State files are simple JSON files which contain information about the that was deployed. You can find all the state files in the .webiny/state folder. They are grouped by stack and by environment that was deployed. Let's take a look at the flow that's going on when you run the deploy command. So first of all, the command will load the environment JSON file from the root of your project, and it will load the environment variable set for the local environment. You can have multiple sets of variables in each of these files, so this flag is a required flag. Then the deploy process moves on to the actual stack you requested. In our case, it's an API stack. It will look for an environment.json file within the stack folder, attempt to load those variables, and those variables can and will override the ones defined by environment.json file from the root of your project if the same name of the variable is used. Then the process will load the resources.js file. This is the key file to consider something to be a stack. So each stack has to contain the resources.js file, and that file contains the definition of your infrastructure. Once this file is loaded, our deploy process constructs a dependency graph of all resources. Why a dependency graph? Because some resources depend on the output of some other resources, and that means that some of them must be deployed first, and some second, and some must be deployed last. So a dependency graph is the key thing here. And once the process knows which resource it needs to deploy first and which goes last, it begins executing the deployment using a component that is defined for each resource. Once each resource is deployed, it writes a state file to .webiny/state/ whatever your stack is. In our case, it will be API. So you can look for the output of each of your component in those files. Okay, now let's jump to our IDE and take a look at the files that we use to define infrastructure. Okay, here we are in our new project. I have deployed it already, so we don't have to wait for a couple of minutes for the deployment to finish. And let's first take a look at webiny.root.js file. Here you'll find this CLI plugin deploy components. So this is the plugin that's responsible for our deployment. And if you disable it, you won't have deploy nor remove commands. So as you can see, this is everything you need to use our default deployment mechanism. Once that is registered, you will be able to run yarn webiny help, and you'll see the deploy and remove commands. The deploy resources from folder or remove resources from folder. And also at the bottom, you'll find examples of the commands. So yeah, if you disable it or remove it, it won't be there, and you can easily create your own deployment mechanism, or maybe even use CloudFormation directly without even using our CLI. So it's the setup is pretty flexible. You can do whatever you want. Okay, so what's going on when you run Webiny deploy API? I'm using API just as an example. It's just a stack. If you have another stack you want to deploy, you will simply add that folder name to the command. So I'm just using the API for the sake of an example. So yeah, Webiny deploy API. It will first load the environment.json file from the root of the project. And the environment you pass to the command is very important because that is the set of variables that will be loaded into the process.env. And those are the environment variables node process is using. After that, the process goes into your stack you're trying to deploy and loads the appropriate environment.json file from there. Then it loads the required environment from that file, and it merges the values. So in case you already have, I don't know, JWT secret variable defined in the root of your project, it will be overwritten by the stack environment JSON file. That's a neat thing you can use to create different configurations. After that comes the main part of the process, this resources.js file. This file is responsible for holding the definition of your infrastructure. There are a bunch of environment variables being configured here, and these are only for convenience. It's easier to pass them into multiple similar services if you simply assign them to a reusable object. If you scroll down, you'll find this resources key, and it contains your resources. So Lambda role is a resource, and this component key defines which component will be used to deploy this resource. The inputs are, well, the inputs to the component. So with this, you are configuring how your component behaves. And if you scroll through the file, everything looks very similar. Apollo Gateway, it also has this deploy, let's call it stage, and the configuration is very similar. It has a component and inputs. Most of these are deployed using serverless function component, which basically means a Lambda function. And let's find something different. For example, a Cognito user pool, same thing. You say, I need a resource called Cognito, and I want it to be deployed using a AWS Cognito user pool component, and these are the inputs to the component, and so on and so on. So the whole file looks like this, and in some of these you will find references to other resources. So for example, security validate access token is a resource, right? But it depends on existence of a Lambda role resource, and it uses the Lambda roles ARN as an input. And that's when the dependency graph comes into play. Before deploying, it traverses this whole structure and it finds the dependencies between resources. Then it simply deploys them in the correct order. For example, this resource depends on Lambda role resource and also on database proxy. So those two must be deployed before deploying this particular resource. And that's it. There's nothing more to it. I'm just going to quickly explain what this watch and build means. So it's a utility which only exists with Webiny with our deployment mechanism. It helps you trigger builds of particular services and also watch resources for changes when you develop. This isn't something you will find in any other infrastructure as code tools. And this is purely our addition to developer experience. So you define these, let's say, stages, and you have a build stage and you have a deploy stage. So during build stage, our deployment mechanism will go into this folder. Let's say it's files transform. Let's take a look at that. So it's files transform, and inside that folder, it will execute a script called yarn build, which you can find if you open package.json. You'll find a build script. And this is how we automate building of services and functions and whatnot by processing this configuration and preparing your code for deployment, so you don't have to do it manually. However, the main thing in this whole process is the deploy stage, which simply grabs a component and passes inputs to it to create resources in your cloud. And that's what the whole file looks like. It's just a bunch of resources with dependencies and inputs, and this is how you configure new resources. If you need to add new functions, you simply add them here. And we also have scaffolding plugins which will automate this for you, so check those out. And let's take a quick look at the .webiny folder, which holds the state files. So state, and then we have API. API is the name of the stack we deployed. So let's go in there, and then we deployed a local environment. So all the state files will be grouped by stack and by environment for that stack. And here you'll find a bunch of files. If you take a closer look at their names, you will actually find a parallel between how resources in your configuration are named and what is stored in the actual state. For example, CMS content. You can find this webiny.cmscontent.json, and this is the actual state which this resource will generate. If you open this file, you will see it has this output key, and this is everything that was output by the actual component which deployed this resource. And you can see configuration and a bunch of other stuff. If you need to review or maybe debug something, this can be useful. So each time a component is loaded, it has its own state file generated. Sometimes a component may load another component within itself, and then it will simply continue the naming by adding the other component's name to the file. And you can see, for example, this image transformer, for example, this resource, internally it loads an AWS Lambda component, and each component must have its own state. So if you go into this AWS Lambda, you will find a little bit different state file, but you don't need to worry about that because each component is independent and standalone, and you can combine them if you need. If you want to see how some of those components are developed, go to our repository and look for packages that are prefixed with serverless. I will show you in the node modules how you can find them. So if you go to Webiny packages, whatever package starts with serverless dash These are the components used for deploying resources. And that's it. You can easily create your own, and you can reference them using local paths. You don't need to publish them to npm just to try them out. You can easily have a folder with custom components inside of your project and simply reference them in as a regular local file, for example, something like this, and this will work just fine. So yeah, I encourage you to dig through the packages we have on our GitHub just to get yourself familiar with how these things work. But in there you won't find any nuclear science. It's a simple AWS SDK, and we are making a bunch of calls to configure your infrastructure. And yeah, that's about it. Okay, that was it. Thank you for watching our knowledge sharing session. I hope you learned something about Webiny, and if you still have some questions, feel free to reach out via Twitter, GitHub, or our community Slack. We are looking forward to seeing you there. Cheers!